I'm Travis Morgan, 42 years old, living in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside Raleigh, North Carolina, the kind of place where the lawns are trimmed on schedule and neighbors wave politely from their driveways. And last month I calmly told my wife, Vanessa Morgan, 36, that our divorce would be finalized by Wednesday, so she could officially be with her gym trainer, Derek Lawson. And I said it while standing at the stove, flipping eggs like I was commenting on the weather. Because by that point I had already spent 5 months documenting every single lie she thought she was clever enough to hide, and there was nothing left in me that felt shocked or emotional about it. I had known something was off long before I had proof, because routines don't just shift overnight without reason, and Vanessa's routines had shifted so dramatically it was almost insulting that she believed I wouldn't notice, from suddenly caring about late strategy meetings, at work to buying new lingerie that never once made an appearance in our bedroom. And while she was busy perfecting her excuses, I was busy building a file so meticulous it could have doubled as an accountant's audit. It started with a credit card statement that didn't make sense, a $742 charge at a boutique hotel in Charlotte on a weekend. She told me she was attending a corporate leadership retreat, and I remember sitting at the dining room table staring at the line item while she showered upstairs, steam drifting down the hallway, my heart pounding, but my face perfectly neutral when she came down and kissed my cheek like everything was normal. And instead of confronting her, I simply logged into the account and downloaded every statement from the last year. Over the next few weeks, those numbers began forming a pattern. Unexplained charges totaling $4,870 spread across restaurants I had never been invited to, spa visits she never mentioned, and 2 more hotel reservations in Charlotte labeled in her calendar as Q3 planning session and executive workshop. And each time she packed her overnight bag with the same careful indifference, telling me she hated these trips, but they were necessary for advancement. And I would nod and tell her I was proud of her ambition while quietly copying her itinerary into a folder on my laptop titled Household Taxes. Derek Lawson entered the picture when I noticed the name attached to recurring payments at her gym, not just membership fees, but private training sessions booked 3 times a week, and I started going through her social media activity at night while she slept beside me, discovering likes, comments, and tag photos that she must have assumed I'd never scroll far enough to see. And that was when I decided emotion would be my enemy and documentation would be my weapon. Before Vanessa ever suspected I knew, I had already secured an attorney, Caleb Turner, a ruthless divorce lawyer in downtown Raleigh, whose handshake felt like a contract, and whose eyes told me he had dismantled men and women far colder than my wife. And I walked into his office with a flash drive containing screenshots, financial records, and copies of hotel confirmations printed neatly in chronological order. For 5 months, I played the role of the unaware husband, cooking dinner, paying the mortgage on time, asking about her work stress, and even listening patiently as she praised Derek's motivational coaching style and casual conversation. While in reality, every word she spoke only strengthened the case I was building, and by the time I told her our divorce would be finalized by Wednesday, I wasn't guessing, I wasn't accusing, I wasn't pleading. I was informing her of a timeline that had already been set in motion long before she realized the game had ended. Vanessa reacted exactly how I expected her to react, because by the time I chose to speak, I had already rehearsed the scene in my head enough times to recognize each phase before it unfolded. And when I told her, calmly and without raising my voice, that the divorce would be finalized by Wednesday and that she was free to pursue whatever future she imagined with Derek Lawson, she blinked at me like I had just mispronounced a word, tilting her head slightly while holding her coffee mug midair, and said she had no idea what I was talking about with a softness that would have sounded convincing to anyone who had not spent 5 months dissecting her behavior. She laughed next, the nervous kind of laugh that stretches half a second too long, insisting that I was being dramatic and asking whether this was some strange joke, and I kept flipping the bacon in the pan while watching her reflection in the stainless steel of the refrigerator door, noting the way her shoulders tightened even before I walked to the dining table and set down the envelope I had prepared the night before. Inside that envelope were printed screenshots of her late-night messages with Derek. Messages time-stamped at 12:14 a.m., 1:03 a.m., 1:47 a.m. Messages that included phrases like counting the hours until next time, and I wish I could fall asleep next to you instead of pretending. And I laid them out neatly, in chronological order across the polished wood surface of the table we had picked out together 8 years ago, watching her eyes move across the pages while her fingers trembled just enough to give her away. She tried one more angle, claiming that the messages were innocent, that Derek was simply a supportive trainer who helped her through a stressful year, and that I was misinterpreting context, but I had already anticipated that defense. and, without changing the tone of my voice, I placed a second stack of papers beside the first. Security timestamps pulled directly from our home alarm system showing that on 3 separate nights, she deactivated the system at exactly 10:58 p.m., 11:02 p.m., and 10:54 p.m., nights she had told me she was driving to Asheville to visit her sister and clear her head. The timestamps showed when the garage door opened, when the front door sensor disengaged, and when the system was reactivated the following mornings at 5:32 a.m. and 6:01 a.m. And I slid those pages toward her slowly, allowing the weight of precision to settle into the room. Because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about a timeline so precise that every excuse collapsed under its own inconsistency. I reminded her that Asheville was 3.5 hours away, that her sister had posted photos from a business conference in Atlanta on one of those same weekends, and I watched as Vanessa's composure cracked in real time, the confident smile fading, the defensive posture dissolving into silence, as she realized I had not stumbled onto fragments of evidence, but constructed a sequence of movements that aligned perfectly with the hotel reservations in Charlotte and the unexplained charges on our joint credit card. For a moment she said nothing, just stared at the documents like they might rearrange themselves into a different narrative, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the realization that denial was pointless when faced with screenshots, timestamps, receipts, and a husband who had taken the time to organize them into labeled sections. Her breathing became uneven, her hand resting flat against the table as if to steady herself, and I felt no satisfaction, no anger, only a detached certainty that the version of our marriage she had been performing was over. Because in that moment she understood that I had built a case not fueled by emotion, but by patience, and that every minute she thought she was being clever had only strengthened the structure I had quietly assembled around her. The moment she realized denial was useless, she pivoted exactly where I knew she would, shifting from pretending innocence to recasting herself as neglected, and she straightened her posture as if moral outrage could erase printed evidence, telling me my long hours managing a construction firm in Durham made her feel invisible and unappreciated, that I was always buried in site reports and payroll projections while she was left alone in a quiet house. And she said Derek actually listened to her, actually paid attention, as if attentiveness were some rare currency she had been starved of for years. I stood there across from her, hands resting lightly on the back of a dining chair, and reminded her that 2 years ago when she first began complaining about feeling distant, I scheduled couples therapy sessions with a licensed counselor in Raleigh, appointments I took time off work to attend, only for her to cancel the morning of the first session and then refuse to reschedule, claiming she did not want strangers analyzing our marriage. And I reminded her how I had sat at this same table, trying to talk through what she called emotional disconnect, while she scrolled through her phone and insisted everything was fine. She tried to interrupt, but I continued calmly, pointing out that last year I planned an anniversary trip to Savannah, reserved a historic suite overlooking the river, arranged dinner reservations at a restaurant she once said she dreamed of visiting, and she cut the trip short on the second day, claiming she felt overwhelmed and needed to return home, leaving me to check out alone while she drove back early. A detail that at the time I interpreted as stress, but that now fit neatly into the larger pattern of avoidance. When she repeated that she felt unseen, I told her loneliness is not solved by secrecy, and I brought up the $1,900 in lingerie purchases that appeared on our joint credit card across 3 separate transactions at boutiques in Raleigh and online specialty retailers. Purchases I never once saw in our bedroom drawers, never once noticed hanging in our closet, and I laid out the receipts, showing the exact dates those items were bought. Those dates matched perfectly with the weekend she claimed to be participating in fitness competitions, events she described as empowering and exhausting, complete with stories about early weigh-ins and post-event dinners with teammates. Yet when I cross-referenced those same weekends with Derek's public social media posts and travel schedule from the gym's website, I found he was in Charlotte or Wilmington or Greensboro for client seminars, and the alignment was too precise to be coincidence. I explained to her that I had no issue with ambition or friendships or personal growth, that I supported her gym membership, her training goals, her attempts to reinvent herself. But what I could not accept was the rewriting of history, the suggestion that my dedication to providing for her household somehow forced her into deception, because managing a construction firm with projects across Durham County meant long hours. Yes, but those hours funded the mortgage, the vacations, the lifestyle. she enjoyed while conducting a parallel relationship in the margins of my work schedule. She accused me of being emotionally unavailable. It was she who rejected therapy, she who dismissed conversations, she who withdrew physically long before I ever discovered a single receipt. And, as she stood there trying to frame Derek as the attentive hero who filled some void I had supposedly created, I simply reminded her that accountability does not disappear just because blame feels more comfortable, and that every explanation she offered now arrived 2 years too late to change the reality documented in ink, timestamps, and transaction records spread across our dining table. When the tears stopped producing the reaction she wanted, her entire demeanor shifted in a way that was almost mechanical, like a switch flipping from vulnerability to hostility, and she straightened her back, wiped her face, and told me with a sharpness I had not heard in years that if I thought I could just walk away unscathed, I was delusional, because she was entitled to half of everything. Half of our $720,000 home, just outside Raleigh, half of my truck, and half of my retirement fund that had taken nearly 2 decades to build and was sitting just under $380,000. And she said it with the confidence of someone who assumed the law would automatically favor her regardless of what she had done. She paced behind the dining table, listing assets like inventory in a warehouse, reminding me of the equity we had accumulated after refinancing 18 months ago, referencing the appreciation of the property and the stability of my business in Durham, as if those facts alone guaranteed her a permanent share. And she added that she would pursue alimony because my income from managing the construction firm significantly exceeded hers, and she seemed almost energized by the idea of turning the situation into a financial battle. I let her finish without interrupting, watching the rhythm of her speech, noticing how her breathing steadied once she felt she had regained leverage, and then I walked calmly to the kitchen counter where I had placed a second envelope earlier that morning, one thicker than the first, and I returned to the table and set it down in front of her without a word. Inside that envelope was the updated post-nuptial agreement we signed 18 months ago after refinancing the house, a document we reviewed in the attorney's office when interest rates dropped and we decided to restructure the mortgage. And I remembered clearly how she had skimmed through it impatiently, eager to leave and celebrate the lower monthly payment, signing each page where indicated without reading every clause in detail. I slid the agreement out and opened it to the specific section already highlighted in clean, deliberate strokes of yellow, and I turned it toward her so she could see the paragraph clearly stating that any verified infidelity by either party would void that individual's claim to shared marital assets beyond personal contributions and eliminate eligibility for alimony. Language drafted precisely and intentionally by the attorney who handled our refinance paperwork. At first she looked confused, then dismissive, as if assuming I was misinterpreting legal terminology. But as she read the clause slowly, her expression began to change, and I could see the moment comprehension replace confidence. Because the wording was not ambiguous, it did not rely on emotional interpretation. It specified that documented evidence of extramarital involvement constituted grounds for forfeiture of claims to jointly titled assets acquired after the agreement's execution. Her hands began to shake slightly as she flipped back to the signature page where her name appeared in ink beside mine, dated and notarized, and I watched her reread the clause again, lips moving silently, as if repetition might alter its meaning. And I explained calmly that the evidence I had compiled met the threshold defined in the agreement, that my attorney had already reviewed it, and that the filing would include both the documentation of infidelity and the contractual stipulation, nullifying her financial claims. In that moment, the aggression drained from her posture, replaced by a stunned stillness that carried more weight than any shouting could have, because she understood that her threats about the house, the truck, and my retirement fund were not bargaining tools, but empty gestures against a legally binding document she had signed voluntarily. And watching her hands tremble over that highlighted paragraph was the first time since this confrontation began that I saw genuine realization in her eyes. The realization that she had not only betrayed the marriage, but legally cornered herself in the process. That same evening I pulled into the driveway expecting silence, but instead I saw an unfamiliar black SUV parked behind Vanessa's car. And when I stepped inside the house I built and paid for, I found her sitting upright on the living room couch with Derek Lawson beside her, legs spread confidently, arms resting on his knees, as if he were preparing for a client consultation rather than trespassing into another man's home. And the air felt staged, heavy with the kind of rehearsed composure people wear when they believe they still have leverage. Vanessa stood when I entered, smoothing her hair, as if presentation still mattered, and Derek rose more slowly, extending a hand I did not take, introducing himself in a tone that suggested he believed this was a negotiation between equals, and I set my keys on the console table without acknowledging the gesture, taking in the calculated positioning of them sitting side by side, as if solidarity alone would shift the balance. They began speaking almost immediately about fairness and maturity, about how dragging things through court would be messy and unnecessary, about how two reasonable adults could reach a private settlement built on mutual respect, and Vanessa spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded conciliatory while subtly suggesting that my documentation and attorney were overreactions, and Derek chimed in occasionally with comments about preserving dignity and avoiding public embarrassment, as if he had any standing to lecture me on decorum inside my own living room. I listened without interrupting for several minutes, watching the way they exchanged glances, clearly having rehearsed this approach, and when Vanessa suggested we avoid court to protect everyone involved and come to a number that would allow her to start fresh without hostility, I finally stepped forward and reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. Without raising my voice, I pressed play on a voice memo recorded weeks earlier, one she had sent to Derek while sitting in her car outside the gym, unaware that our vehicle's Bluetooth system automatically archived paired recordings, and her own voice filled the room with unmistakable clarity, promising Derek that she would secure at least $250,000 from me before filing, reassuring him that I was too busy and too trusting to see it coming, and describing the money as their launch pad for something bigger once everything was finalized. The sound of her voice echoing through the living room shifted the atmosphere instantly, and I watched Derek's expression change from confident to confused as the implication settled in, and before either of them could speak, I walked to the coffee table, where I had already placed a slim folder earlier that afternoon. Anticipating theatrics, I opened the folder and handed Derek printed screenshots of text messages between him and Vanessa, messages dated only 3 weeks prior, where she referred to him as a temporary distraction, told him not to get too attached, and explicitly stated that she needed to lock in a financial cushion before making any permanent decisions about leaving me, and I made sure he saw the timestamp and her contact name at the top of each page. He read in silence at first, his jaw tightening as his eyes moved across the lines, and Vanessa attempted to speak over the evidence, claiming context was missing, claiming stress made her exaggerate, but the words were there in black and white, unfiltered and unedited, and the tension between them shifted palpably as he absorbed the fact that he had not been a partner in some grand escape, but a calculated component in her financial strategy. I stood there watching the narrative unravel, not with anger, but with the same steady composure I had maintained from the beginning, because this was never about intimidation or negotiation, and as the silence stretched between the three of us, it became clear that the alliance they walked in with had fractured under the weight of her own recorded intentions. The shift in Derek's posture was immediate and unmistakable, the confidence that carried him into my living room dissolving into something sharper and far less controlled, and he turned toward Vanessa with a look that no longer held solidarity, but accusation, demanding to know what she meant by temporary distraction and financial cushion. His voice no longer measured or diplomatic, but edged with humiliation, and she reached for his arm instinctively, as if physical contact could contain the unraveling narrative. She began speaking quickly, words tripping over one another as she insisted everything had been taken out of context, that the messages were exaggerated venting during a stressful period, that I had manipulated the timing to make her appear calculating, and she tried to reframe the voice memo as sarcasm misinterpreted by technology, but the steadiness in Derek's expression was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he had not been a romantic partner in some grand rebellion against a cold marriage, but a strategically placed variable in her exit plan. He stepped back from her slightly, glancing at the printed text again, as if confirming that the language did not magically transform on a second reading, and I watched the tension build between them without inserting myself further into the exchange, because the evidence had already done the work I intended it to do. When Derek accused her directly of using him as leverage, of positioning him as a stepping stone rather than a destination, Vanessa's composure fractured completely, and she raised her voice in defense, claiming he was overreacting, claiming that emotions complicate conversations, and that he was focusing on semantics instead of intent. And the carefully rehearsed partnership they had presented moments earlier disintegrated into pointed gestures and overlapping arguments. I waited until there was a brief pause in their escalation and then spoke calmly, Not louder than before, not sharper, simply clear, and I reminded them that the divorce documents would be electronically delivered at 8 a.m. Wednesday, that my attorney had already prepared the filings, and that no amount of reframing or renegotiation would alter the timeline that had been set in motion weeks ago. Vanessa tried to redirect the conversation back toward compromise, suggesting we could still avoid court if we discussed terms rationally. But the urgency in her voice betrayed the fact that control had slipped from her grasp, and Derek, now visibly agitated, demanded clarity from her about whether he had ever been anything more than a contingency plan, his words carrying a sting that cut through the room's earlier artificial calm. As their argument escalated, I stepped away from the coffee table, walked toward the hallway without haste, and left them in the living room, surrounded by the documents that had dismantled their united front, hearing Derek accuse her of manipulation and deception while she shouted that he was twisting everything and refusing to understand her perspective, their voices rising and colliding in the space that had once held quiet evenings and shared routines. I closed my office door behind me, the sound of their conflict muffled but still audible through the walls, and for the first time since discovering the affair 5 months earlier, since the first suspicious charge and the first sleepless night analyzing timestamps, I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for far too long. Not triumph, not revenge, but control, a steady awareness that every decision I made from this point forward would be deliberate, documented, and entirely my own. Over the next 48 hours, Vanessa's composure dissolved into a relentless stream of messages that lit up my phone from early morning until well past midnight, each notification carrying a different variation of desperation, starting with apologies that attempted to sound reflective and sincere, then escalating into promises to cut Derek off completely, to block him on everything, to prove that he had meant nothing, and eventually sliding into pleas about counseling, reconciliation, and the idea of renewing our vows, as if a symbolic ceremony could erase documented deception. She wrote paragraphs insisting that she had been confused, that she lost herself somewhere between routine and resentment, that she was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild what we had, and she attached photos from past vacations, screenshots of old messages where we had called each other best friends, and even a picture of our wedding day, as if nostalgia could override evidence. But I did not respond beyond a single acknowledgement, directing her to communicate through my attorney moving forward. While her messages grew increasingly emotional and erratic, I spent those same 48 hours moving with deliberate calm, driving downtown Raleigh to Caleb Turner's office where the air inside the conference room felt clinical and controlled, the large windows overlooking the city skyline reflecting a version of my life that was no longer tethered to hers, and I placed every printed document, every digital archive, every timestamp and transaction record on the polished table for final review. Caleb examined each piece methodically, confirming that the voice memo had proper metadata authentication, that the text screenshots included visible phone numbers and dates, that the security system logs were certified copies, and that the financial records clearly illustrated a pattern of deception aligned with the clause outlined in the postnuptial agreement we had signed 18 months earlier. And his tone remained steady as he outlined the filing sequence, the service timeline, and the procedural expectations within Wake County Court. We finalized the paperwork with precision, reviewing each page before I signed where indicated, and Caleb made it clear that should Vanessa attempt to contest the divorce or challenge the enforcement of the infidelity clause, the evidence portfolio would be presented in full, including financial inconsistencies and documented misrepresentations that extended beyond the affair itself. And he emphasized that transparency in court would not favor someone who had already demonstrated calculated intent. I instructed him to proceed without delay, to ensure electronic delivery of the documents at exactly 8 a.m. Wednesday as scheduled, and to prepare an immediate response strategy in case she attempted to stall proceedings with emotional appeals or last-minute negotiations. Because at that point clarity mattered more than reconciliation, and structure mattered more than sentiment. Through Caleb's office, I had a formal communication drafted and delivered, making it explicitly clear that any attempt to drag the process out unnecessarily would only increase public exposure of her documented behavior within the official record of Wake County Court, and that a swift, uncontested resolution would minimize collateral damage to both parties. But resistance would invite comprehensive disclosure. As I left the office and stepped back onto the sidewalk in downtown Raleigh, the weight of uncertainty that had hovered over me for months felt replaced by something steadier. Not satisfaction, not bitterness, but resolve. And while Vanessa continued flooding my phone with promises to rewrite history, I focused solely on execution. Because in those 48 hours the outcome had shifted from emotional confrontation to procedural certainty, and every signature placed on those finalized documents represented the closing of a chapter she had already chosen to end long before I ever spoke the words aloud. By Wednesday night, she signed the papers, and the signature that once symbolized unity now marked the formal collapse of everything she had gambled on. Because sometime between Derek reading those texts in my living room and the documents arriving electronically that morning, he had decided he wanted nothing more to do with her once he understood the full scope of how she had planned to manipulate both of us for leverage. And I knew this not from gossip or assumption, but from the silence that followed, the absence of his SUV in my driveway, and the abrupt shift in her messages from defiant to cornered. Caleb confirmed the signed documents late that evening, his voice measured and efficient as he explained the filing was complete and uncontested, and when I ended the call I stood in the kitchen of the house she once threatened to claim as half hers, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the wall clock, realizing that the structure she assumed she could fracture was still firmly beneath my feet. Within 3 weeks, she packed what remained of her belongings into cardboard boxes and moved into a small apartment in Fayetteville, a far cry from the $720,000 home she once calculated into her imagined settlement. And I watched from the front window as she loaded the last of her things without offering commentary, without confrontation, because by then words had lost their relevance. The house felt different after she left, not emptier in a dramatic sense, but quieter in a way that felt honest, as if the walls were no longer absorbing whispered lies or calculated excuses, and I began reclaiming spaces that had felt tense for months, reorganizing the office, clearing out drawers, replacing the living room rug she insisted on choosing years ago, not out of spite, but out of a simple desire to remove reminders of performance. One evening, not long after the final paperwork was processed, I carried a glass of bourbon out to the back deck and sat alone facing the tree line that bordered the yard, the late North Carolina air warm but steady, and for the first time since I noticed that first suspicious charge on her credit card, I allowed myself to sit without analyzing, without planning, without bracing for confrontation. The real victory was not the preservation of the house, or the retirement fund, or the truck she once threatened to take, though those outcomes mattered in practical terms, but something far less tangible and far more stabilizing. Because the woman who believed she could outmaneuver me through secrecy and calculated emotion had ultimately dismantled her own safety net, and in doing so revealed that the leverage she trusted was built on assumptions rather than preparation. I thought about the months I spent quietly documenting every inconsistency, every timestamp, every transaction, and how restraint had proven more powerful than reaction. And as I sat there listening to the subtle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic beyond the neighborhood, I understood that what remained was not bitterness, but clarity. She walked away with nothing more than the consequences of her own betrayal, and I remained exactly where I had always stood, in control of my decisions, my property, and my future, knowing that the quiet certainty settling over that back deck was worth more than any settlement she once imagined she could secure.